In the high valleys of the Absaroka Range, in the Montana Territory of late 1887, winter was not a season. It was a predator. It stalked the canyons and descended upon the isolated homesteads with a silent, crystalline fury that could freeze the marrow in a man's bones. The settlers of the Arrow Creek settlement knew this predator intimately. They had measured their lives against its coming for years, hoarding firewood, chinking their log cabins, and praying for a mild season. But winter was never mild. It was only less brutal, or more. That autumn, a man named Theodore was building something that made no sense. To the 8 other families huddled in the valley, his actions were a source of quiet mockery and open concern. While they were splitting and stacking cords of pine and cottonwood, reinforcing their doors and patching their roofs, Theodore was hauling rock. Not logs, not sod, but stone. He spent his days with a small cart and a stubborn mule, wrestling fieldstone from the creek bed and dragging slabs of soapstone from a small quarry he'd found 2 miles up the canyon. He was building a monster inside his modest 400-square-foot cabin, a colossal mass of stone and clay mortar that consumed the very center of his living space. It was not a fireplace with its familiar gaping maw. It was not a stove, at least not like the cast-iron potbellies that were the pride and centerpiece of every other home. It was a solid, hulking block of masonry, nearly 8 feet tall and 5 feet wide, with a small iron door near the bottom and a strange, offset chimney pipe. The men of the settlement would stop by, ostensibly to offer a hand, but really to gawk at the foolishness. William, the settlement's unofficial leader and most experienced frontiersman, stood one crisp October afternoon, hands on his hips, watching Theodore meticulously fit a stone into place. William had built 3 cabins in his life. He had survived 15 Montana winters. He knew the physics of heat and cold as a wolf knows the scent of deer. What he saw in Theodore's cabin was a violation of every principle of survival he held dear. What did this quiet man, this immigrant with a strange accent and even stranger ideas, know that they did not? What secret was he building into that bizarre monument of stone, a structure that seemed designed to invite the cold in and trap it forever? The settlers watched and whispered, certain that Theodore, and likely his young family, would not see the spring. They were wrong, and the proof of their error would be paid for with a terrible price. Before we can understand the genius of what Theodore was building, we must first understand the profound and fatal flaw in how everyone else was trying to survive. We must look at the science of heat, the tyranny of cast iron, and the brutal mathematics of a frontier winter. The story of Arrow Creek in the winter of 1888 is not just about one man's strange stove. It is a story about 2 competing philosophies of warmth, and only one of them was based on a true understanding of the enemy. Let us examine the standard cabin of the era. These were structures born of necessity and speed. They were typically built with single-wall log construction. The logs, often pine, were felled, stripped, and notched. The gaps between them were chinked with a mixture of mud, moss, and horsehair. This method was fast. It was effective enough in the summer, but in the winter, it was a thermal sieve. The R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of a solid 6-inch pine log is approximately 7.5. The chinking, when perfectly applied and maintained, might be slightly higher, but it was never perfect. It cracked, it shrank, it fell out. Air infiltration was constant. Every seam, every corner, every joint around the single-pane glass windows was a conduit for heat to escape and for the biting cold to enter. A typical cabin in Arrow Creek had a total effective R value of perhaps R8, R10 on a good day. For comparison, a modern, well-insulated wall is R20 or higher. Into this thermally inefficient box, the settlers placed their champion against the cold: the cast iron stove. Whether it was a Franklin stove, a potbelly, or a simple box stove, the principle was the same. Cast iron heats up very, very quickly. It radiates intense, scorching heat in a direct line. This is the heat that you can feel on your face from 10 feet away. It is immediate, powerful, and deeply deceptive. The settlers worshipped this heat. They saw it as the only weapon powerful enough to fight back against the -30-degree nights. They would stuff the firebox with pitch pine, and the stove would glow a dull, menacing red. The temperature 3 feet from the stove might soar to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. But this was a tiny bubble of artificial summer in an ocean of Arctic cold. The physics of this system were disastrously inefficient. The stove's intense heat rose directly to the ceiling. The temperature in the rafters of William's cabin could be 85 degrees, while the temperature on the floor, where his children slept, was a mere 38. This extreme temperature stratification meant that most of the heat produced was not warming the living space. It was pooling uselessly under the roof, where it found every available crack in the shingles and escaped into the atmosphere. Furthermore, the combustion process itself was a major source of heat loss. To burn that hot and fast, the stove required a tremendous amount of oxygen. It sucked in vast quantities of the very air it had just heated and shot it up the stovepipe along with the smoke. This created a powerful negative pressure inside the cabin, which in turn pulled more frigid outside air in through the countless cracks in the walls. The stove was, in effect, actively working to ventilate the cabin with Arctic air. The fuel consumption was astronomical. A family like Williams would burn through a quarter of a cord of wood in a single brutal week. That's a stack of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet long, and 2 feet wide. The work was relentless. The men spent their days chopping and hauling, their hands split and raw from the cold. The fire needed to be fed every hour, sometimes more. At night, someone had to wake up in the freezing dark every 2 hours to stuff more logs into the hungry iron beast. If they failed, the fire would die. Within an hour, the temperature inside the cabin would plummet to match the outside. It was a constant, exhausting, and losing battle. This was the established wisdom. This was the conventional method. It was a system of violent, inefficient, and fleeting heat, demanding constant tribute in labor and wood. It was the only way they knew. And it was into this world of accepted truth that Theodore brought his mountain of stone. William was not a foolish man. He was a practical, experienced leader whose advice had saved lives. His skepticism was rooted in what he saw as common sense and hard-won knowledge. He approached Theodore one afternoon in early November, his breath pluming in the air. The shell of the masonry stove was complete, a silent gray monolith in the dim cabin. "Theodore," William began, his tone a careful mix of authority and neighborly concern. "I have to say, I don't understand this. That much stone, it will never get warm. You'll burn a whole cord of wood just trying to heat the rock." Theodore, wiping clay mortar from his hands with a wet rag, simply nodded. He was not a man for arguments. He preferred demonstration. But he offered a simple explanation. "It is not for heating the rock quickly, William. It is for holding the heat for a long time." William scoffed, a sharp, barking sound. "Hold the heat? By the time that thing is warm, your children will have frostbite. You need the fire now. You need the heat now. That's how you fight the cold. You hit it back, hard." He gestured with his mittened hand toward his own cabin, from which a thick plume of smoke was furiously churning. "My stove can drive you out of the room in 10 minutes. That's power. That's survival." He then pointed to the complex path Theodore had described for the chimney. The smoke, instead of going straight up, would travel down one side of the mass, across the bottom, and up the other side through a labyrinth of channels before exiting. "You're going to choke yourself out," William stated, his voice flat with certainty. "All those bends and turns, the smoke will back up. It's a death trap. You need a straight, hot flue to draw properly. Everyone knows that." Another neighbor, a man named Samuel, who had joined William, chimed in. "And the moisture, Theodore, all that rock and mortar. In this cold, it'll never cure right. It will sweat all winter. You'll have dampness and rot in your walls by spring. You're building a cave, not a home." The arguments were logical. They were based on their direct experience with conventional fireplaces and stoves. A cold chimney doesn't draw well. A massive object takes a long time to heat up. Intense, direct heat feels effective. To them, Theodore's creation was not just strange. It was a direct contradiction of the known principles of fire and shelter. The mockery spread through the small community. The children would run past Theodore's cabin and call it the Rock House or Theodore's Folly. The women would whisper at the communal well, pitying Theodore's wife, who would have to endure a winter in a cold, damp, and smoky tomb. They saw him as a stubborn fool, an outsider who refused to listen to the wisdom of those who had come before. Theodore never defended himself. He never raised his voice. He met their skepticism with a quiet, unwavering calm. He had seen this stove work in the old country, in winters that made Montana seem mild. He understood the principles at play, not through guesswork, but through generations of accumulated knowledge. He knew the difference between the fleeting, aggressive heat of burning iron and the deep, persistent warmth of stored thermal energy. So he just kept working, meticulously sealing each joint, parging the exterior with a smooth layer of clay, letting his actions be his only argument. He was building not just a stove, but a vessel for a different kind of fire. A gentle, efficient, and enduring fire. To comprehend the revolution taking place inside Theodore's cabin, we must delve into the physics he was harnessing. His creation, a masonry heater, operated on principles that were the polar opposite of the cast iron stove. William was an expert in radiation. Theodore was a master of thermal mass and convection. The core concept is specific heat capacity. This is the measure of how much energy it takes to raise the temperature of a given mass of a substance. Cast iron has a specific heat capacity of about 460 joules per kilogram per degree Celsius. The stone and clay mixture Theodore was using had a specific heat capacity of roughly 880, nearly double that of iron. Furthermore, and more critically, the total mass of his heater was immense. William's potbelly stove weighed perhaps 250 pounds. Theodore's masonry heater, a carefully constructed assembly of fieldstone, soapstone, and clay mortar, weighed approximately 8,000 pounds. Doing the simple math reveals the staggering difference. To raise the temperature of the entire mass by 1 degree, Theodore's heater required vastly more energy. This is what William correctly identified as a weakness. But it was, in fact, its greatest strength. Once that energy was stored in the 8,000-pound mass, it did not dissipate quickly. The heater became a thermal battery. While the iron stove radiated its heat away almost as fast as it was produced, Theodore's heater absorbed the intense energy of a fast, hot fire and then released it slowly and gently over a very long period. The combustion process itself was key. Inside the firebox, which Theodore had lined with special fire bricks he had painstakingly hauled from Bozeman, the fire was designed to burn incredibly hot and fast. He would load it with a relatively small amount of wood, about 25 to 30 pounds, and open the air inlet wide. This created a fire that burned at over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, combustion is nearly perfect. All the volatile gases, the tars, and the creosote that would normally coat the inside of a conventional stovepipe were incinerated. The smoke leaving the firebox was little more than carbon dioxide and water vapor. This is why William's fear of a clogged, smoky flue was unfounded. The superheated, clean-burning exhaust gases were then directed not straight up the chimney, but through the serpentine maze of channels within the heater's mass. This was the genius of the design. The hot gases would take a long, slow journey, sometimes over 30 feet, through the masonry. As they traveled, they transferred their heat into the stone. By the time the gases reached the top and exited the chimney, they had cooled to a mere 250 to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Compare this to William's stove. The gases roaring up his stovepipe were often over 700 degrees. That is a massive amount of wasted energy. Heat that was produced by his precious firewood and immediately thrown away into the sky. Theodore was capturing that waste heat. His system was extracting over 85% of the potential energy from the wood. The iron stove, on a good day, was lucky to be 30% efficient. The heat released by the masonry heater was also fundamentally different. It did not produce the scorching, direct radiant heat of red-hot iron. Instead, the entire 8,000-pound surface of the heater warmed to a gentle, steady temperature of about 120 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. It was warm enough that you could comfortably rest your hand on it. This massive, moderately warm surface heated the cabin primarily through gentle, radiant waves and slow, steady convection. This process eliminated the extreme temperature stratification seen in the other cabins. The heat was released low to the ground and rose gently, creating a uniform temperature from floor to ceiling. There was no useless pool of superheated air in the rafters. The air was simply and consistently warm. This gentle, pervasive warmth also heated the objects in the cabin: the floor, the walls, the furniture, which in turn radiated their own heat, creating an environment of deep, stable comfort. The final piece of Theodore's system was the cabin itself. He had spent the autumn meticulously rechinking every single log with a mixture of clay and moss that remained flexible in the cold. He built interior shutters for his windows that he could seal at night. He understood that his efficient heater was only half the equation. The other half was creating a structure that could hold the precious heat he was producing. His cabin, with its carefully sealed envelope, probably achieved an R value closer to R12, a significant improvement over his neighbor's leaky R8 structures. He was fighting a smarter war against the cold, conserving his energy instead of trying to overwhelm the enemy with brute force. So, the system was this: a small, very hot and very brief fire, burned once or twice a day. This fire's energy was almost entirely captured and stored in a massive thermal battery. That battery then slowly and gently radiated a comfortable, even heat for the next 12 to 24 hours. It was efficient, it was stable, and it was about to be put to the ultimate test. The first signs of the coming disaster were subtle. In early December, the chickadees, usually boisterous and active, fell silent. The deer herds moved down from the high country weeks earlier than usual, their coats thick and shaggy. Theodore, who had learned to read the land, noted these things with a quiet sense of foreboding. He made one final, careful inspection of his stove, sealed his shutters, and brought in an extra week's worth of water, just in case the creek froze solid. On December 16, 1887, a strange, pale light filtered through a high, thin layer of clouds. There was no wind. The air grew unnaturally still and heavy. The usual sounds of the valley, the cry of a hawk, the rustle of wind in the pines, vanished. It was a phenomenon the old-timers called a still cold. It was the most dangerous kind. A wind-driven cold feels more brutal, but it also churns the air. A still cold allows the heavy, frigid air to settle into the low places, a suffocating blanket that leaches heat from everything it touches. That night, the temperature dropped to -20 Fahrenheit. The next day, it dropped to -25. By the third day, the thermometer on William's porch, a new and expensive one he trusted implicitly, read -34. And it stayed there. For 2 weeks, the temperature in the Arrow Creek Valley never rose above -30. The sun was a weak, hazy disk in the sky, offering no light and no warmth. The great stillness of '88 had arrived. For the 8 families relying on cast-iron stoves, the ordeal began immediately. The battle for heat became their entire existence. The stoves, which had seemed so powerful, were now revealed to be terribly inadequate. They blazed red-hot, consuming wood at a terrifying rate, yet their effect was minimal. The intense cold of the exterior walls and windows created powerful convection currents within the cabins. The warm air from the stove would rise, travel across the ceiling, hit the cold outer walls, and plummet to the floor as a cascade of frigid air. The settlers felt as though they were living in a constant, miserable draft, even with the doors and windows sealed. William's family huddled together on benches, pulled as close to the stove as they dared, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Leaving this tiny circle of warmth was a physical shock. To fetch water from the bucket by the door was to plunge back into the Arctic. The floor was so cold that their boots froze to it if they stood still for too long. Condensation from their breath and the boiling stew pot froze in thick, crystalline ferns on the interior walls. The fuel crisis became acute within 3 days. William had planned on using a cord of wood every month during the worst of winter. They were now burning that much in a week. The men had to venture out into the brutal, airless cold to chop more wood. The work was agonizing. The steel of their axes was brittle and prone to shattering. The wood itself, frozen solid, was as hard as iron. Every swing was a monumental effort that left them gasping, their lungs burning from the frigid air. Frostbite was a constant threat. Samuel returned one afternoon with the tips of his ears a dead, waxy white. Inside, the misery was constant. The children were always cold and sick with hacking coughs. Sleep was nearly impossible. The person whose turn it was to feed the stove would sit, wrapped in a buffalo robe, dozing fitfully, jolted awake by the sudden chill that signaled the fire was dying. The others would sleep in a pile of blankets, their breath freezing on the wool above their faces. The temperature in the cabin, away from the immediate vicinity of the stove, hovered between 35 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a lethal, exhausting, and demoralizing existence. They were not living in their homes. They were besieged within them. During this time, no one saw Theodore. His cabin was silent. The chimney on his roof emitted only a thin, wispy plume of smoke for about an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. The rest of the time, it was dormant. To the other settlers, this was a grim confirmation of their fears. William, his face etched with worry and fatigue, looked over at the still chimney and felt a pang of guilt. "His fire is out," he said to his wife, his voice raspy. "He's run out of wood, or the flue is blocked. They must be freezing in there." The consensus was that Theodore's folly had failed, and that a tragedy was unfolding in silence just a few hundred yards away. It's hard to imagine the sheer physical and mental toll of that kind of cold. And before we reveal what was truly happening inside Theodore's cabin, it is worth pausing to reflect on the nature of belief. The settlers of Arrow Creek were not ignorant. They were clinging to a method that had worked, just barely, for years. Their belief in the power of the iron stove was a belief in their own experience. But experience can sometimes be a trap, a wall that prevents us from seeing a better way. They were about to witness something that would shatter that wall forever. After 10 days of the relentless, soul-crushing cold, a crisis point was reached. Samuel's youngest child had developed a severe pneumonia, her breathing shallow and ragged. His wife was suffering from frostbite on her feet, acquired inside their own home. Their woodpile was nearly gone. Desperate, Samuel bundled himself up and struggled through the deep, powdery snow to William's cabin. "William, we're done for," he said, his words choked with desperation as he stumbled inside. "The wood is gone. I can't cut anymore. My hands, I can't feel them. The baby is sick. We can't make it through another night." William looked around his own strained household. His wood was also dangerously low. His family was shivering. He knew he had to do something. The community, as it always did in times of crisis, would have to band together. The plan was to move Samuel's family into William's larger cabin, pooling their resources. It was a grim prospect, more mouths to feed, more bodies straining the meager warmth of his overworked stove. As they discussed the logistics, William's gaze drifted once more to Theodore's cabin. The chimney was, as usual, perfectly still. No smoke, no sign of life. "We have to check on them," William said, a grim finality in his tone. "It's our duty. We can't let them freeze in there without at least trying to help." He felt a heavy responsibility. He had been the most vocal critic of Theodore's stove. He had laughed at it. Now, he imagined the grim scene he would find inside. A family huddled together, frozen solid, a monument to one man's stubborn pride. William and Samuel made the short journey across the snow-covered clearing. The cold was absolute, a physical presence that seemed to press in from all sides. They reached the door and knocked. There was no answer. They knocked again, harder, shouting Theodore's name. After a long moment, the door latch scraped, and the door opened a few inches. Theodore stood there. He was not wearing a heavy coat. He was in his shirt sleeves. Behind him, they could see his wife sitting at a small table, sewing. His young son was on the floor, playing with some wooden blocks. But it was not the sight of them that stunned William and Samuel into silence. It was the feeling. A wave of warmth washed over them. Not the harsh, dry heat of an iron stove, but a gentle, pleasant, and all-encompassing warmth. It was like stepping into a different season. Theodore saw the shock on their faces and simply opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. "You look cold." William and Samuel stepped inside, and their world tilted on its axis. The air was warm, not just near a stove, but everywhere. The floorboards were warm beneath their frozen boots. The walls were not coated in ice. The air was fresh and clear with no trace of smoke. William instinctively looked up. There were no scorch marks on the ceiling, no layer of superheated air. He looked at the thermometer hanging on the far wall, a twin to his own. It read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He stared at it, uncomprehending. His own cabin, with a fire blazing so hot the stove groaned, was struggling to stay at 40 degrees in the living area. This place was a summer afternoon. He looked at the monstrous stone heater in the center of the room. It was not glowing. There was no sound of a crackling fire. He cautiously reached out and placed a trembling, gloved hand on its surface. It was pleasantly, deeply warm, like a sun-baked rock in August. Where is the fire?" William stammered, his mind unable to reconcile what his senses were telling him. "It is finished," Theodore said calmly. "I burned it this morning. A small fire, for about an hour. It will be warm like this until I burn another tomorrow morning." The statement was so simple, so contrary to everything William knew, that it barely registered. One small fire, once a day? He thought of his own insatiable stove, of the endless, back-breaking cycle of chopping and feeding. He looked at Theodore's wood box. It was small, and it was nearly full. He saw maybe 40 pounds of wood in it. That was a 2-hour supply in his own home. For Theodore, it was more than a day's worth. The data was undeniable, a physical refutation of his entire worldview. Let us make the direct comparison. William's cabin, a leaky structure with an R value of perhaps 8, was heated by a 30% efficient iron stove. It consumed approximately 700 pounds of wood per week to maintain a stratified, drafty internal temperature that averaged 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The family lived in a constant state of cold stress and exhaustion. Theodore's cabin, a tighter structure with an R value of perhaps 12, was heated by an 85% efficient masonry stove. It consumed approximately 210 pounds of wood per week, 1/3 the fuel, to maintain a stable, comfortable, even temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit. His family was warm, healthy, and well-rested. The numbers were not just different, they represented two entirely different realities. One was bare survival. The other was civilization. Samuel, his desperation overriding his shock, explained the situation with his sick child. Without a moment's hesitation, Theodore's wife stood up. "Bring them here," she said. "There is room. It is warm here." William stood frozen for a moment longer, the full weight of his error crashing down on him. He had not just been wrong in his assessment of the stove's design. He had been profoundly, fundamentally wrong about the nature of heat itself. He had mistaken violent, inefficient power for strength. He had mistaken quiet, enduring efficiency for weakness. He had mocked the very thing that could have saved them all from this ordeal. He looked at Theodore, this quiet man he had dismissed as a fool. He saw no triumph in his eyes, no hint of "I told you so." He saw only a calm, compassionate neighbor offering shelter. William, a man known for his pride and certainty, drew a slow, shaky breath. The warm, clean air filled his aching lungs. He looked at the stone heater, then at Theodore, and uttered the words that would change the Arrow Creek settlement forever. "I was wrong," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a complete and total capitulation. "Theodore, I was wrong. This works. Will you teach us?" That afternoon, Samuel's family moved into Theodore's cabin. The moment his sick child was brought into the stable, 68-degree environment, her breathing eased. The constant, shivering stress on her small body was lifted, allowing her to finally fight the illness. For the first time in over a week, the families of William and Samuel were truly warm. The children, who had been listless and huddled, were soon playing on the floor, their laughter a sound that had been absent for too long. Word spread quickly. The other families, seeing the activity and smelling the stew cooking on the warm surface of Theodore's heater, came to investigate. Each one had the same reaction as they stepped through the door, a moment of silent, stunned disbelief, followed by a dawning realization of the magnitude of their collective error. They touched the warm stone, they felt the even heat, they saw the tiny woodpile, and they understood. The great stillness finally broke a few days later. The temperature rose to a comparatively balmy 0 degrees. But the lesson had been seared into the community's consciousness. The crucible of the cold snap had not just tested two heating systems, it had tested two ways of thinking. One was loud, arrogant, and wasteful. The other was quiet, humble, and wise. The legacy of Theodore's folly began the very next spring. As soon as the ground thawed, the men of the settlement, led by a newly humbled and incredibly enthusiastic William, began quarrying stone. William became the stove's strongest advocate, explaining the principles he had once mocked with the fervor of a convert. He described the thermal battery, the clean combustion, and the gentle, radiant heat to anyone who would listen. Theodore, in his quiet way, became a teacher. He didn't lecture, he showed. He guided them through the complex construction of the flue channels. He taught them the proper mixture for the clay mortar. He explained why a small hot fire was better than a large smoldering one. He shared the knowledge that had been passed down to him, a gift from the old world that proved its value in the new. Over the next 2 years, 7 more masonry heaters were built in the Arrow Creek Valley. Each one was a monument to a lesson learned the hard way. The character of the settlement changed. The frantic, exhausting work of stockpiling massive amounts of firewood was replaced by a more measured, efficient approach. The winters were no longer a brutal siege to be endured, but a quiet season to be lived. The health of the community improved. The persistent winter coughs and sicknesses that had plagued the children became a rarity. The lesson of Arrow Creek is not just about the thermal dynamics of a well-built stove. It is a profound parable about humility. It is about the danger of believing that the way you have always done things is the only way they can be done. William and the others were not bad people. They were prisoners of their own experience. Their iron stoves had worked, barely, and so they had never been forced to imagine something radically different. Their knowledge had become a form of blindness. Theodore's wisdom was rooted in a deeper, older source. It was ancestral knowledge, refined over centuries in climates far harsher than Montana. He brought a solution that was, in its essence, ancient. Yet to the frontiersmen, who saw themselves as the pinnacle of rugged innovation, it seemed like dangerous foolishness. They mistook a lack of loud, brute force for a lack of power. The truth was that Theodore's stove was infinitely more powerful, but its power was subtle, intelligent, and patient. That first stove, the original Theodore's Folly, stands to this day. The cabin is gone, its logs long since returned to the earth, but the stone heater remains, a solid, defiant monolith in a clearing of aspen trees. It is a testament to a quiet immigrant who listened to the wisdom of his ancestors, a man who understood the gentle, irresistible physics of stored warmth. It is a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are not new at all, but are simply old truths, patiently waiting for us to be cold enough and humble enough to listen. The story reminds us that true innovation often requires looking backward, to forgotten principles, and that the loudest, most obvious solution is rarely the best one. True strength is not in the violent, fleeting blast, but in the slow, steady, and enduring radiation of wisdom.